Okay, good night, or good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are watching this video broadcast, either live or recorded here on YouTube. It is coming to you from Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia. On May the 6th, 2002, in other words, just over 20 years ago, was assassinated a controversial Dutch sociologist, writer, and politician, Pim Fortuyn. He had assembled in the months leading up to his assassination a populist right-wing leaning group called Lijst Pim Fortuyn or Pim Fortuyn List. And because the assassination happened only 9 days before the scheduled Dutch parliamentary elections to elect the members of the Dutch House of Representatives, or Tweede Kamer, the second chamber, which is the Dutch parliament's lower and directly elected house, his name could not be removed from the ballot, even though, of course, he could not take his seat, and partly out of sympathy for him and his clever and original sounding ideas on how to fix various problems of the Dutch society. His list received 26 seats out of 150 in the Dutch House of Representatives. And it also was included in the first cabinet of the Christian Democratic Prime Minister Jan-Peter Balkenende. However, within months, the cabinet broke down because of infighting inside the Pim Fortuyn list. None of the prospective leaders had his charisma, and then this led to the dissolution of the Dutch parliament in the autumn of 2002 and to snap parliamentary elections in January 2003, where the new party only received 8 seats. And then the following Dutch parliamentary elections in 2006 eliminated it from the Dutch parliament. However, the right-wing populist streak that was, either begun or reflected anyway by the emergence of the Pim Fortuyn list was continued by the Partij voor de Vrijheid, or Freedom Party, led by a controversial far right-leaning Dutch right-wing populist politician, Mr. Geert Wilders. And this political party is still, in 2022, one of the major political parties in the Netherlands, even though in the recent Dutch parliamentary elections it has suffered defeats. And then there's another right-wing or far-right-leaning populist party in the Dutch parliament called the Forum for Democracy. In the 2021 Dutch parliamentary elections, these two political parties received, I have to scroll down here, I think they received a total I'll quickly count seats here. Yeah, the Freedom Party received, or Party for Freedom received 17 seats, which made it the third largest party after the right-wing Liberal People's Party for Freedom and Democracy of Prime Minister Mark Rutte, and then the centrist Liberal Party Democrats, 66. And then the Forum for Democracy received 8 seats, so 25 out of 150 seats in the Dutch Parliament's lower house, or 1/6, went to these two right-wing or far-right leaning populist political parties. So what specifically happened early on the evening. It happened, the assassination itself happened around 6 p.m. Dutch time. On May the 6th, 2002. Yes, just minutes earlier, Mr. Fortuyn had completed what became, sadly enough, his last radio interview. I once actually listened to that recording. Well, since I have never studied the Dutch language, I didn't understand most of what he was saying. He had, however, in the months leading up to his assassination, more than once expressed his fear for either his life or at least his physical safety. Most notoriously, he declared on one of the most popular Dutch televised talk shows at that time, hosted by Mr. Robert Jensen and called simply Jensen, on March the 22nd, 2002, so just 1.5 months before his assassination, referring to the numerous death threats that he said, and he tried to use some form of understatement, funny understatement, by saying that if you saw my mailbox with the threats I'm getting, it doesn't exactly cheer you up. And then he accused the Dutch government, at that time a coalition of the Social Democrats or the Labour Party, ironically one of his former political parties, and then the two liberal parties, the People's Party for Freedom and Democracy and Democrat 66. He accused the government of having created a climate that had personally demonized him. In other words, he accused the Dutch government of having, in the guise of democratic and open political debate, of having essentially prepared and published caricatures of him, or even propagandistic distortions of him and his views that labeled him as a dangerous far-right extremist. He didn't consider himself one. Actually, and ironically, he claimed to be defending the Dutch traditions of openness, a liberal democracy, tolerance, equality, opposition to discrimination and extremism of any kind, by opposing further immigration from the Muslim countries. He considered Islam a backward culture, while claiming that he did not hate Islam or Muslims. However, he wanted this change, radical though it was, to be produced through peaceful, free and fair elections, and of course debates and votes in the Dutch parliament. He was originally a sociologist and a writer. But then let's describe his assassination. A 32-year-old left-wing Dutch environmentalist and animal rights activist, Mr. Volkert van der Graaf, had followed Mr. Fortuyn on the Dutch mass media and probably also social media for some time, and he had decided to take the extreme action of trying to assassinate Fortuyn in order to prevent Fortuyn from gaining political power by manipulating the weaker members and groups of the Dutch society. So he bought that gun, and then he also bought a map of the media park of Hilversum, a city to the south of Amsterdam, which is the better known of the two Dutch capitals. It's the kind of people's capital of the Netherlands. The politician's capital is The Hague, which is the seat of the Dutch national government and of parliament. So Mr. van der Graaf announced to the animal rights company for which he was working, or to his employer, that he was taking the afternoon off because of the beautiful spring weather, and the uh, employer innocently gave him leave of absence. So he traveled to Hilversum and he found the media park. He hid in the bushes near the media park's main building, and out of the loudspeaker of the media park, he heard parts of what would be Mr. Fortuyn's last interview. Then, shortly after finishing the interview around 6 p.m. that evening, Mr. Fortuyn emerged from the building in the company of several others. And then Mr. Van der Graaf emerged and then first walked in the opposite direction. And then after Mr. Fortuyn and his friends or acquaintances, anyway, the people accompanying him, had passed Mr. Van der Graaf, then Van der Graaf turned around, and from a distance of about 1.5 meters or 5 feet, he fired 6 shots towards Mr. Fortuyn. 5 of them hit him in the back, fatally wounding Mr. Fortuyn. The 6th shot missed him. So Mr. Fortuyn obviously fell to the pavement, fatally wounded, and one of the people in his company called the ambulance, which arrived shortly, but then despite all the efforts to save Mr. Fortuyn's life, it was too late. His vital organs had been too seriously damaged. Well, anyway, Mr. Van der Graaf fled the media park, and he was chased by 2 or 3 other people. And since the police had also been called, police officers also joined in the chase, and in a nearby gasoline station, he surrendered to the police officers after they pointed their weapons at him. At first, Mr. Van der Graaf refused to cooperate with the police investigators, but eventually then he revealed his motive or motives for assassinating Mr. Fortuyn, and he strongly claimed that he had acted alone. He was not part of any kind of conspiracy to assassinate Mr. Fortuyn, and during the police investigation and the trial, this claim was confirmed. So he was sentenced to 18 years in prison. According to the Dutch tradition, first-time offenders such as Mr. Van der Graaf typically served 2/3 of their sentences. Credit was given for the months he had spent in custody following his arrest on May the 6th, 2002, and he vowed to leave the Netherlands or emigrate in 2018. Obviously, his career prospects for the rest of his productive life are limited because he's a convicted assassin, although he later on expressed remorse, claiming that if he could go back those years to the year 2002 when he assassinated Mr. Fortuyn, he would not do it. Whether his remorse was caused by Christian or other religious conversion or some kind of moral awakening, or by simply regretting having thrown away a dozen years of his productive life, or maybe a combination of these factors, or then obviously the fact that this assassination disrupted his family life. Several people related to him went into hiding already the night after the assassination, because they also feared for their lives, or at least their physical safety and health. Mr. Fortuyn was born in February 1948 in Driehuis, within the Dutch municipality of Velzen, as the 3rd child to a middle-class Catholic family, and throughout his life he identified as a Catholic. His father was a salesman and his mother was a housewife. He attended the Merdal College secondary school in Haarlem, and he was described as academically gifted. As a teenager, he at first wanted to train as a priest, but in 1967 he started to study sociology at the University of Amsterdam, and then transferred after a few months to the Vrije Universiteit, or Free University in Amsterdam. In 1971, he graduated with the academic degree doctorandus. In 1981, he became a doctor of sociology at the University of Groningen. He worked as a lecturer at the Nyenrode Business Universiteit and as an associate professor at the University of Groningen, where he taught, interestingly enough, Marxist sociology. He also was employed by the Groningen University newspaper, and he wrote columns for that newspaper. At the time, he was indeed a Marxist and even sympathized with the small Communist Party of the Netherlands, but he never formally joined it. Later, he joined the Labour Party or the Social Democrat. In 1989, he became a director, or the director, of a government organization administering student transport cards, and worked as an advisor to the Social and Economic Council. In 1990, he moved to Rotterdam. From 1991 to 1995, he was an extraordinary professor at the Erasmus University Rotterdam. Erasmus is a Europe-wide, or at least European Union-wide, student exchange program. Not the only one of them, obviously. He was appointed to the Albeda Chair in Employment Conditions in Public Service, and he even had an education consultancy business. After his contract as an extraordinary sociology professor ended in 1995, he became a public speaker and writer, working as a weekly columnist for Elsevier. And gradually he involved himself in politics through regularly appearing on televised debate shows. One of them was the Lagerhuis, Lagerhuis, literally translated as the Lower House or the Commons, hosted for many years by Paul Witteman. In or around February 1997, following the publication of his controversial and much debated book, Tegen de Islamisering van onze cultuur, or in English, Against the Islamicization of Our Culture, he debated a member of then the Dutch Labour Party, who some years after Fortuyn's tragic assassination joined the Socialist Party, Marcel van Dam, who had briefly been a member of the Dutch Parliament and even a cabinet minister. Mr. van Dam tried to show during that heated debate, which lasted about 8 to 9 minutes, that Fortuyn reportedly or allegedly was some kind of an extremist who was trying to provoke the ordinary Dutch people into fighting against Muslims, and he was overgeneralizing the Dutch Muslim community, which at the time, as he pointed out, numbered under 3% of the Dutch population. Now I think it's over 6% already, but still it's not a big religious community in the Netherlands. While Mr. van Dam admitted that Mr. Fortuyn was partly correct in pointing out that there were extremists in the Dutch Muslim community, he strongly denounced what he called Mr. Fortuyn's overgeneralizations and exaggerations and distortions of facts. Mr. Fortuyn, for his part, denounced Mr. van Dam as a populist who was trying to hit him below the belt and who was representing the politically correct church. They both did agree that the Muslim women had a right to emancipation, and then the responsible Dutch people, like themselves, like each other, should um, support them. However, they disagreed concerning the means. At one point, Van Damme claimed that Fortuyn wanted to, or would have preferred to, force the Muslim minority in the Netherlands to behave as he wanted them to. That they would look him in the eye, that they wouldn't wear those long dresses, and would go neatly into the swimming pool like the ordinary Dutch people did. At one point, with a smile, Mr. Fortuyn claimed, "You're making a caricature of my book, Mr. Van Damme." And at one point late in the debate, Mr. Van Damme made the outrageous claim that Mr. Fortuyn was an extremely inferior human being. And his final question to Mr. Fortuyn during the heated debate was, "Why do you think that Jan Maat, a notorious and unpopular Dutch far-right politician, Hans Jan Maat, had offered to Mr. Fortuyn a membership in his party?" So his implication was that unless Mr. Fortuyn was an extremist himself, Mr. Jan Maat would never offer to make him a member of his small party, the so-called Center Democrats. But anyway, that debate did make Mr. Fortuyn much more of a household name in the Netherlands. And in the 5 years following, leading up to his tragic assassination, he became increasingly better known. He was interviewed, I think, in the wake of the 9/11 terrorist attacks in September 2001 by a controversial and very well-known Dutch filmmaker and journalist, Theo van Gogh. Yes, related to the troubled but talented late 19th century Dutch painter Vincent van Gogh. And they both agreed that Islam in the Netherlands, while the Muslims, law-abiding Muslims, had every right to live there, and especially those who tried to integrate into the mainstream of the liberal and tolerant and democratic and postmodern Dutch society, it would be advisable for the Netherlands either to stop further immigration from the Muslim countries, or at least consider clearly or radically reducing it, albeit through peaceful, legal, and democratic means. So, in the 1970s, after having flirted with communism and Marxism, Fortuyn joined the Labour Party. In 1986, his views shifted towards neoliberalism in the hope that the free market or capitalism would lead to further individual emancipation. So the people would no longer be oppressed by the state bureaucracy. In 1991, he even proposed firing half of all civil servants in the Netherlands and promoted privatization and decentralization. In 1992, he wrote On het volk van Nederland, to the people of the Netherlands, where he declared himself to be the spiritual successor of the charismatic but controversial 18th century Dutch patriot politician Johan Derk van der Capellen tot den Pol. In the 1990s, he became a member of the center-right or right-wing liberal People's Party for Freedom and Democracy. And before his assassination, he was briefly even a political consultant to the centrist Christian Democratic Appeal. Economically, he largely remained a neoliberal, but culturally, he soon became strongly influenced by the neoconservative political philosopher and chief editor of the weekly Elsevier, Hendrik Jan Schoo, who made him a columnist in 1993. Schoo deplored that a progressive new class would have promoted multiculturalism, founding an anti-racist civil religion on Article 1 of the Dutch Constitution forbidding discrimination. Dutch neoconservatives understood that in the ever more secularizing, in other words, increasingly removed from religion and especially from its public exercise and promotion, and attempts to convert other people to one's religious beliefs. Netherlands, but that is the case in most other Western countries, the United States being one of the rather few notable examples. The United States is ironically at the same time one of the Western countries' most religious and most secularized countries. In other words, religiously, like otherwise, including politically and culturally, it's an increasingly polarized country, although so are many other ones nowadays. That a change on the lines of the right-wing Republican Reagan revolution of the 1980s in the United States had become highly improbable. A growing number of Dutch people either advocated or accepted or tolerated women's rights, homosexual rights. Well, Fortuyn was openly homosexual, by the way. Abortion and euthanasia. In his book published in 1995, De Verwaiste Samenleving, The Orphan Society, he claimed that the progressive movement of the 1960s had eroded traditional norms and values. Both the roles of the symbolic father and the caring mother had been lost, leaving an orphaned population without guidance to live out the meaningless, decadent existence. However, interestingly enough, Mr. Fortuyn did not propose a return to the old socially conservative or Dutch Calvinist and iconoclastic values. He rather argued that the media, schools, and artists should provide a moral leadership, explicitly promoting and defending the new values of the modern Western society, constantly recreating the Dutch society. And as an open homosexual himself, he consistently retained a liberal stance on matters such as the sexual minorities' rights throughout his political career. In his book, Against the Islamicization of Our Culture, he argued that the Dutch should counter Islamic fundamentalism, to which he claimed that many members of the Dutch Muslim community were vulnerable because so many of them were members of the lower social classes, by promoting and defending their own fundament or foundational value, Dutch culture, especially modernism and the Enlightenment values. However, these should not have been yet imposed on the Dutch population as a whole, with the exception of immigrants. In 2001, he announced his intention to run for the Dutch parliament, although he did not yet specify which party he would seek to stand as a candidate with or to run as a candidate of. Then in February 2002, so just 3 months before his assassination, he gave an interview to Volkskrant, a Dutch newspaper, regarding his beliefs on immigration and Islam. His statements were considered so controversial that the Leefbaar Nederland, or Liberal Netherlands Party, fired him as its leading candidate the next day. Against the advice of his campaign team, Fortuyn said in the interview that he favored closing borders to Muslim immigrants, and if possible, he would abolish the peculiar article in the Dutch constitution forbidding discrimination. And then, just 2 days after his interview on February the 11th, 2002, he founded his own party, Pim Fortuyn List, taking many former members of the Livable Netherlands Party and supporters with him. In early March 2002, so just 2 months before his assassination, the Livable Rotterdam Party received about 36% of the seats in the city council elections. So for the first time since the Second World War, the Labour Party was out of power in Rotterdam. And then in March, also in March, he released his book, The Mess of 8 Purple Years, De Puinhopen van 8 jaar Paags, where he criticized the social democratic liberal coalition governments that had governed the Netherlands since 1994 under Prime Minister Wim Kok. And he criticized the political system of the Netherlands and he used that book as his political agenda for the upcoming Dutch parliamentary elections. However, in one of the press conferences to promote the book on March the 14th, 2002, a left-wing activist from the Biotic Baking Brigade threw a urine or feces-filled pie at him. And as a result, Fortuyn began to express a fear of being injured or assassinated and accused members of the Dutch political establishment, such as the government, of encouraging violence against him. And indeed, in the 2 decades that have passed after his assassination, right-wing and even far-right populism have become clearly more popular in the Netherlands and sadly in many, if not most, other Western democracies. So they, especially those right-wing and national conservative and far-right populists who want to expand their political base, they shrewdly emphasize different themes to different groups. To those people who dislike the traditional representative parliamentary democracy, they propose initiative. So a certain percentage of the eligible adult voters could initiate laws which would then be voted on in referendums. So initiatives, referendums, and also in some countries like the United States, the recall or firing during their terms by direct vote certain public officials. And then to business people, they claim to be supporters of free enterprise. They want to cut the red tape involved in establishing and managing businesses. They advocate lower taxes. Those who are tired of the welfare state, they propose privatizing various social programs. Then those who hanker back to the so-called traditional values, they claim to be supporters of those values. Those who are critical of multiculturalism, they say that they are also critical of it. And then they often recruit or try to recruit young people, claiming that they are for the young people's rights. They want more generous student allowances and housing benefits. They would like to abolish or at least clearly or radically lower the tuition payments. And then those who are nostalgically attracted to the former dictatorships, such as the fascist and Nazi ones, they also make sympathetic statements. And then just like, or similarly to the late Austrian far-right leaning populist politician, Jörg Haider, they then claim that their statements apparently advocating some form of return to the former fascist or Nazi or other dictatorships, they claim that they have been quoted out of context. In other words, they, similarly to the previous US President Donald Trump, claim that the mainstream media is a fake news media and they are engaged in political witch hunt to silence them, since they are only exercising their freedoms of speech, expression, opinion, and religion, and so forth. So Fortuyn's ideology included the following parts, according to this Wikipedia article: civil liberties, classical liberalism, criticism of Islam, deregulation, so cut the red tape on business, for example, or businesses, direct democracy, so binding referendums, Euroscepticism, freedom of speech, laissez-faire, so capitalism, LGBT rights, republicanism, because the Netherlands is a constitutional parliamentary democracy until now, secularism, separation of church and state, small government, women's rights. He was compared with the politicians Jörg Haider and the notorious longtime leader of the French far right, Jean-Marie Le Pen, in the foreign press. But he denounced those comparisons as being distorted. On May the 5th, 2002, just one day before his assassination, he, in a debate with Ad Melkert, who was then the leader of the Dutch Labour Party, organized by one of the Dutch newspapers, Algemeen Dagblad, claimed that he was demonized. So he said that he often had to tell journalists that the image of him in the media was incorrect. So, let's go to some other articles here. So, more than a murder of a human being, according to one of my online sources commemorating the 20th anniversary of his assassination, many Dutch people saw Mr. Fortuyn's assassination as the murder of Dutch innocence and Dutch democracy. So before May the 6th, 2002, the idea of someone being murdered for their ideas was something alien to most Dutch people. In fact, at least officially, the previous political assassination there, aside from, of course, the multiple murders that took place during the roughly 5 years of the Nazi German occupation of the Netherlands during the Second World War, had happened in the late 17th century, so over 300 years earlier. And the Netherlands used to be one of those countries where one of the Western democracies, especially where when they were not on duty, politicians, civil servants, other celebrities could be seen shopping among the ordinary people. And often then they were greeted or sometimes even heckled by ordinary people. But then, in retrospect, in hindsight, they should have seen this coming, because assassinations or assassination attempts against politicians had gradually increased, even in the mostly democratic Europe, ever since, for example, the murder of the Swedish Prime Minister Olof Palme in February 1986. And then in, was it 1991, there had been the assassination attempt against leading German Christian Democratic politician Wolfgang Schäuble, which left him paralyzed from the waist down and confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life. And then 16 months after Fortuyn's assassination in September 2003, on the eve of the Swedish referendum on joining the euro currency, which is the currency of many, actually most countries of the European Union, that economic, political, and even largely military organization where most European countries belong, Foreign Minister, the Swedish Foreign Minister, Mrs. Anna Lindh, a social democrat, was stalked, ambushed in a popular Stockholm department store by Mr. Mihailovic, a Yugoslav-born immigrant, and then brutally stabbed. And despite hours of frantic efforts by the surgeons and nurses to save her life, she succumbed to her injuries. So following Fortuyn's death, his political party did exist, but then vanished from the Dutch political scene after losing its last remaining parliamentary 2006 Dutch parliamentary elections. It disbanded in 2008. But then, as I said, Mr. Wilders has continued this tradition of right-wing, and in his case, for example, far-right leaning Dutch political populism. But sadly, there are tens of other countries where such parties are now increasingly popular, although, of course, populism is not just a right-wing or a far-right ideology, it's also centrist, environmentalist, and left-wing ideology, to some extent even a Christian ideology. Research by Een Vandaag opinion panel shows that 24% of Dutch voters said that they would vote for Mr. Fortuyn in the elections if he was still alive. And while 72% of the respondents find Fortuyn's ideas important to Dutch culture, 45% of them also admit that he has contributed to a division in society. So on Friday, May the 6th, 2022, several cities and towns in the Netherlands commemorated Mr. Fortuyn's murder. The Beeld van Pim Foundation and the political party Leefbaar Rotterdam, so it's still alive 20 years after his assassination, among others, organized a memorial march, and Rotterdam commemorated the assassinated politician with a symposium in the city hall. Although Fortuyn's sympathizers are obviously nowadays mainly on the right wing of the political spectrum, voters from the centrist Liberal Party Democrats, 66, or in Dutch Democraten 66, 43%, the Socialist Party, 50%, and even the Labour Party, 44%, are also positive about him. One respondent said that Mr. Fortuyn pulled problems out of the taboo. In other words, he started to discuss questions that, according to the conventional wisdom and political correctness, should not have been discussed publicly, such as multiculturalism, whether it's really implementable, able to be capable of being put into practice, and whether the Muslim immigrants and refugees and asylum seekers should be accepted as equals without questioning their religious beliefs. And another said the political commotion he caused was much needed. Een Vandaag presented Fortuyn's views to the opinion panel. Only 4% labeled his ideas as far-right, 71% even placed him in the center or the right of the political spectrum. And 73% of the respondents, so nearly 3/4, agree with his position that refugees can be better received in their own region. About 60%, or 3/5, agree with Fortuyn's idea that the norms and values of Islam do not fit into Dutch society. But we, of course, do know that Islam has never been a totally monolithic or homogeneous society, that there are at least several, if not many, strands of Islam as there are of any other notable religion, be it Christianity, which is, to be fair and accurate, an even much more diverse religion than Islam. Even Judaism, although it has only a fraction of the adherents of either Christianity or Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism, Sikhism, New Age, those indigenous animist religions, syncretistic religions like Baha'i. Well, I mean, there are all kinds of Muslims, all the way from those who are Muslims in name only. Secularized, they live just like their secularized neighbors or spouses, partners, children, and so forth. They may even be closet atheists, but they have never publicly denounced Islam or at least they can be agnostics who doubt if God or some other higher being exists, but do not consider it impossible. And on the other end of the spectrum are the Muslim extremists who are willing to kill, as they call them, infidels in the name of religion. But such a spectrum can be found inside Judaism, Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, Jainism, any kind of other notable religion. No religion is totally monolithic. And then I'll read bits and pieces of an interesting academic paper which I found while Googling sources for this video, called A Political Assassination and a Crisis of Legitimacy, the Murder of Pim Fortuyn. Chapter 10, written, this was researched and written, I think, by Arjen Boyne, Sanneke Kuipers, and Tim de Jong. So this was published in 2018, I think. So it wasn't such a long time ago that the Netherlands, like many other Western democracies, was a country where politics were dull and predictable. So the country was run by professional politicians who gained their seats in parliament by virtue of their ranking within their party and the electoral success of that political party. Proportional representation, and actually the Netherlands has at the national level one of the most accurate forms of proportional representation, because in the elections to the Dutch parliament's lower house, the Tweede Kamer, or second chamber, meaning the Dutch House of Representatives, all it takes is clearing the vote threshold of 2/3 of 1%, 0.67%, in order to win a seat in the parliament. And no wonder the Dutch parliament's lower house always contains over 10 political parties. The current one contains 17, which then means that often there are weeks or even months of negotiations to form a new government. In 2021, it took 9 months for the parties to at last agree to form a new government after the elections led by the Liberal Prime Minister Mark Rutte. So the Dutch House of Representatives is like a smørgåsbord or sandwich table. Virtually all the voters who are serious about participating in politics by voting can find a political party among those 17 political parties that at least roughly mirrors their political preferences. And not a single party is even close to having a majority of seats. The biggest party, the center-right People's Party for Freedom and Democracy, has only 34 seats out of 150, which is 22.7%, so less than a quarter. So proportional representation typically resulted and still results in a fragmented political landscape. Political parties needed to form a multi-party majority coalition to govern, and they still do. Contested issues were depoliticized in coalition compromises. Scandals were rare. Political decision-making was consensus-oriented, in other words, seeking a broad agreement on the big lines of domestic and foreign policy. Similarly to such Nordic countries as my distant native land, Finland, in Northern Europe, especially during the quarter century when it was governed by its authoritarian eighth president, the late Dr. Urho Kekkonen. and parliamentary debates were characterized by a non-confrontational style. And this all, according to these academicians, changed after Pim Fortuyn, a candidate for the list of Pim Fortuyn or Pim Fortuyn List Party, was assassinated on May the 6th, 2002, while campaigning for the upcoming national elections, which were then only 9 days or just over 1 week away. So according to Friedland, this source was published already in 2002, so within months of the assassination of Mr. Fortuyn. Where there was harmony, now there is discord. Where there was faith, now there is doubt. So he was ironically paraphrasing that famous prayer composed some 800 years ago by Saint Francis of Assisi. Where tranquility was the national norm, a new anxiety stalks the land. In Holland, which is the informal name for the Netherlands, even though it only refers, properly said, to two of its provinces, South Holland and North Holland. That byword for flat, tedious stability politics has grown hot and turbulent. As if the mass resignation of its government last month was not enough, now the Netherlands, that was referring to the resignation of the first government of Christian Democratic Prime Minister Jan-Peter Balkenende in the autumn of 2002, so several months after Mr. Fortuyn's assassination, or some months. Now the Netherlands is contemplating the fallout from its first political assassination since the 17th century. So Mr. Fortuyn was the most controversial politician the Netherlands had seen in a long time, or at least the most controversial politician to be at the same time notably popular, because although Mr. Janmaat was also a controversial politician and certainly more an extreme rightist than Mr. Fortuyn ever was, he never was popular. However, his small far-right party, which was deceptively named the Center Democrats, did receive a few seats in the Dutch parliamentary elections because of the very proportional electoral system. And of course, since 2006, Mr. Geert Wilders of the Party for Freedom, which is clearly leaning towards the far right, has become even a considerably more controversial politician than Mr. Fortuyn. According to Mr. Wilders' English language Wikipedia article, he frequently has to change the apartments where he sleeps, or houses where he sleeps, because of the numerous death threats that he has received over the years, not the least because of his strident criticism of Islam and Muslims and his erroneous claim that there is no such thing as a moderate Islam. There is. Most Muslims are, in fact, moderates. Although a growing minority, unfortunately, are radicals of various kinds. And Mr. Wilders' office has even been strategically placed in a wing of the Dutch parliamentary building where it can only be accessed through one set of stairs. So, because Fortuyn was not a professional politician, he had served as a sociology professor and was also a public speaker and writer, a professional pundit, in other words, a person who made predictions on political and social issues about their outcomes. He had never held political office before. And he announced his emergence onto the political scene with a number of books that criticized the state of the Dutch society, although such people existed elsewhere in the Western democracies and elsewhere in the world. So he was not, in that sense, a unique politician, but in the Dutch political consensus culture, he definitely seemed somewhat of an enfant terrible, or terrible child, or a troublemaker. Openly homosexual, he loved to share stories about sexual encounters, being chauffeured or driven around in his pink Rolls Royce, always telling it like it is. He baffled the political establishment. According to Buruma, published in 2002, Fortuyn was in a way to Dutch politics what the late Princess Diana was to the British monarchy. Incidentally, Diana died in the tragic car crash with her boyfriend, uh, Dodi Al Fayed, and the driver Henri Paul, just under 5 years before Fortuyn's assassination in August 1997 in Paris. A spoiler, a populist jester who managed with consummate public relations skill, although Diana didn't want to make controversial statements to provoke people. She just wanted to share her her struggles with her deep feelings of unworthiness, not the least because academically she was more a failure than a success. Of course, if she had been allowed to sit, as the term goes in British English, in other words, to take the exams privately in the presence of only a supervisor, a tutor, or um, a teacher, and of course, if the time limits had been more lenient, she would probably have received at least average grades because she was not stupid. And she loved to write compositions, but she dreaded the exams and therefore she failed even her secondary school's ordinary exams. And then she worked briefly in a number of low-paying jobs, and then eventually, in or around 1979, became a kindergarten teacher's assistant. And it was during that job, which she held for some 1.5 to 2 years, that she met Princess Charles, and then they became romantically involved, and the rest is history. To poke a stuffy, complacent, out-of-touch establishment in the eye. In Diana's case, it was to question the value of having these centuries-old traditions of the British royal family. While she was not a Republican, small r Republican, she did believe that the British royal family should change with the zeitgeist, or spirit of the age, become a considerably more democratic, commonplace, accessible, and also be willing to confront its own problems more publicly. He managed to convince the people, het volk, in Dutch, I think, that he was on their side, that he spoke for them and understood their concerns. And in the months leading up to his assassination, he received at least 25 life threats. And although he had received those threats, although he was the leader of an emerging political party that was already garnering support in the 15% range in the public opinion polls, he did not receive police protection. This despite the fact that numerous countries on the face of the earth, including numerous Western democracies, had tightened the protection of their public figures, including politicians, following the September 2001 terrorist attacks on the United States. And despite the fact that his campaign was swirling around controversy, and then there had been that pie attack, in other words, human waste or urine-filled pie being thrown at him less than 2 months before his assassination. According to one of the history books which I purchased in Finland, it contained various political controversies or assassinations. Fortuyn occasionally hired private bodyguards, but even he was not wealthy enough to always have them protecting him against potential attacks when he made public appearances. Fortuyn did, however, say there have always been death threats against me. I asked the Prime Minister, meaning Mr. Wim Kok, for protection, but he won't pay. If I die, it is on his head. And then he tossed his head back and laughed, according to Lang, published in 2002. So this question would become a pivotal challenge in the meaning-making phase of the deep political crisis that was triggered by Mr. Fortuyn's assassination. Within hours of the assassination, an angry mass assembled in front of the Dutch National Parliamentary building in The Hague. At the same time, the Dutch cabinet was meeting to formulate a response to the assassination. The crowd became violent and tried to enter the building. A very thin blue line protected the parliamentarians, many of whom feared for their lives. Well, in flashback and in hindsight, this was one of the foreshadows of the January the 6th, 2021 riot in Washington, D.C. that resulted directly in the death of one protester, indirectly in the deaths of 3 other protesters, and then indirectly also in the death of one Capitol police officer. And many of the politicians and journalists who were there later stated that if the riot police had shown up a little later, the Parliament building would have been stormed by the rioters. Okay. And then, of course, we have to remember that in the democracies such as the Netherlands, most other European countries, Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and dozens or tens of other countries in Latin America, in Africa, here in Asia, and in Oceania, to an extent, the people do have a right to protest because of the freedoms of speech, opinion, expression, the press and other mass media, social media, freedom, also association, peaceful protest, and petition. But then where do you draw the line? Obviously, the protests must not become so loud and violent as ever to threaten anyone's physical safety, let alone his or her health or his or her very earthly life. And therefore, the public figures, such as politicians, civil servants, actors, actresses, singers, musicians, and so forth, they do need, especially those of them who make public appearances in person, not just online frequently, they do need police protection. And then the protesters have to remember not to threaten anyone's health or safety, not to be so loud, not to chant the kinds of slogans which are likely not just to offend, but even to intimidate people. So you can disagree while disagreeing politely. You can be serious without using foul language. You can get your message across without having to physically threaten anyone. These are, basic principles, not just of a political science or social science course, but even of common sense. Decisions on whom to protect followed an evaluation procedure that was run by 2 separate but largely overlapping committees, a technical evaluation committee and a more strategic evaluation committee. However, these committees, while very valuable ones, lacked clear criteria for these assessments other than the presence of concrete threats to physical safety. Who were their members? Representatives from different organizations in the security, police, and the intelligence agencies. And the committees were depending on information from the 25 police regions of the Netherlands. However, neither the National Police Unit nor the National Intelligence Agency, Korps Landelijke Politiediensten, and Algemene Inlichtingen en Veiligheidsdienst actively requested such information from the regional police forces or Commissie Feiten Onderzoek Veiligheid en Beveiliging Pim Fortuyn. In essence, any threat analysis depended on whether information on specific threats was pushed upwards to the national committees. And since the political assassinations, especially, and even smaller acts of political violence, in other words, the non fatal injuries, had been so uncommon in the Netherlands before Pim Fortuyn's assassination, simply it seems, according to these academicians, that even most members of the Dutch security and intelligence officers were not prepared for such acute threats. So most organizations were never designed to detect low probability contingencies, such as the risk of political assassinations, let alone crises in the making. And according to these Dutch academicians, Fortuyn himself apparently did not expect to be murdered. He did, however, express concern for his physical health and safety. He had not reported all the incidents that compromised his personal safety. He was ambiguous about his wish for protection and reportedly concerned about his privacy. Well, by contrast, Theo van Gogh, that controversial Dutch filmmaker and journalist and even sometime debater, who was assassinated 2.5 years later in November 2004, he, according to a version of his English language biography available on Wikipedia, said, "No one kills the town fool." While he did warn certain people who were his colleagues in the Dutch media communities to take care of their personal safety, he apparently did not take those death threats seriously enough until one morning in early November 2004, he was assassinated brutally by gunshots and then stabbings by, the actual fatal wounds came from gunshots fired by Mohammed Bouyeri, a radicalized Muslim living in the Netherlands and of Moroccan descent. And then Bouyeri tried to decapitate the chubby corpse of Mr. Van Gogh, and then used 2 knives to pin a radical Muslim message to the chest of the assassinated filmmaker. Mr. van der Graaf, at least, did not go so far. Mr. Bouyeri wanted to overkill his victim and even desecrate the victim's corpse. Mr. van der Graaf was just content with killing Fortuyn and then fled the scene. And while Mr. van der Graaf has later expressed remorse for the murder that he committed, Mr. Bouyeri has never done so. And accordingly, he has been sentenced literally to life imprisonment. So until he passes away, he will be incarcerated. That's the maximum penalty available in the otherwise rather liberal Dutch criminal justice system. So outside the governmental complex in The Hague, that includes the Dutch Parliament and the Prime Minister's offices, a growing group of belligerent or warlike protesters had assembled on the evening of May the 6th, 2002. There were few police officers to protect the buildings. Politicians reportedly feared for their personal safety, And in that hectic environment, initial meaning making took place. So Prime Minister Wim Kok, together with the Ministers of Interior and Justice, issued a statement to the press. Reading from a piece of paper in the hot lamps of the media, a pale and sweating Minister of Interior looked everything but confident. But then again, quite many other public figures, politicians and others would have been and even showed themselves to be deeply shocked by what had happened just hours earlier. His story was defensive and his voice was shaky. After offering condolences and expressions of shock, as of course he should have, the Minister of Interior declared that the assassination could not have been foreseen, asserting that the intelligence and police services had conducted a thorough analysis into the death threats against Mr. Fortuyn and had not found any reason to offer protection. This explanation naturally was unconvincing at best. It's a bit like the school shootings. I mean, they have been common for decades in a number of countries of the world, most notoriously because of its extremely developed mass media and social media industries, the United States. But of course, they do take place elsewhere occasionally, or sometimes in Canada, probably quite frequently in Latin America, even though they rarely seem to be among the headlines. In Africa, well, especially school kidnappings do occur there, particularly by the extremist Muslim terrorist organization Boko Haram in Nigeria, Central Africa, Africa's most populous country. Sometimes in Russia, sometimes in various Asian countries, while Russia is both a European and Asian country. In Oceania, I think they are very rare. At least I haven't heard of them. But anyway, even earlier this century, and I'm now speaking of my distant native land, Finland, where within the space of 10.5 months, first in early November 2007, incidentally on the 19th anniversary of the Soviet or Russian Bolshevik or Communist Revolution, and then in late September 2008. Two young men, in the first incident chronologically an 18-year-old grad student of senior high school who should have graduated in May 2008. And then in the second incident, a 22-year-old hospitality student in a Western Finnish Polytechnic College, murdered in cold blood. Several people. The first one murdered 8 people, including the principal of his senior high school. The second one murdered 10 people, including one of his teachers and 9 of his classmates. So in the first incident, 6 students of the senior high school, including one adult student, were murdered, and so were the school nurse and the school principal. So in both incidents, there were some students who at first didn't realize what was happening and just thought that it was some sort of a rehearsal. But now in hindsight, some 1.5 decades later, we can say that whenever such actions are being taken, you had better take cover and tell others to do the same, and then lock yourselves in some secure locations. And if either the principal or some other teacher of the school announces on loudspeaker that there is either a gunman or some other criminal prowling around or a suspected one, and everyone must stay in their classrooms and lock the doors and hide under the tables, then you must obey. If there are rehearsals, then any responsible adult, a teacher or someone else, or even a police officer will tell you that this is only a rehearsal. It did not help that the government immediately decided to provide all political party leaders in parliament, as well as all members of the cabinet, with personal protection. although this was understandable. However, it was annoying to Fortuyn supporters that deliberate bureaucratic processes were no longer required. Procedures were followed, but now at warp speed. Many of Fortuyn's followers suspected that the establishment, meaning the entrenched politicians and civil servants and so forth, did not want to protect him. In Germany, France, and Britain, especially opposition leaders received protection. These governments do not want to see their biggest critics harmed, said the spokesperson for the list, Pim Fortuyn list, in Parliament. No wonder there were a number of conspiracy theories according to which somehow the Dutch national government or some of its members or the Dutch police or security forces or armed forces or civil servants had been behind the assassination, even though no such evidence has ever been found. While the Pim Fortuyn party or Pim Fortuyn list only existed for 6 years, its legacy does remain to this day in the form of two far-right leaning Dutch populist political parties, the bigger one, the Party for Freedom, led by Geert Wilders, and then the smaller one, led by the Forum for Democracy. And as I said, they have 1/6 of the seats in the Dutch lower house of parliament. So what conclusions can we draw according to these academicians, and what lessons what we can learn from a crisis that brought deep what can we learn from a crisis that brought deep political uncertainty and unprecedented displays of public emotion to the normally stolid, in other words, firm Netherlands, and unemotional one? The obvious lesson is that political contestants must be protected from harm. And then seemingly technical decisions may have far-reaching political implications. And then the possibilities of certain threats to political legitimacy, which may seem very low at one point, can change in a very short period of time. Periodic reassessment of the threat continuum is therefore required. And then on a smaller scale, nowadays, if even children and teenagers joke about shooting people dead, we have to take that threat much more seriously than was the case still a quarter century ago, or even, say, 15 years ago, because we never know exactly who among them are seriously contemplating shooting people. What may sound like a childish, boyish, girlish sense of humor, albeit warped one, may sometimes contain deep-seated threats of actual plans to murder others. Even if strategic priorities are altered in time, that does not mean much if information processes are not adapted as well. Unfortunately, threat detection is often organized as a bottom-up process in which it is left to operators, meaning, for example, cabinet ministers or secretaries, and then in those countries where the presidents are executive leaders as well, or in other countries, prime ministers, usually, if they are democracies, at least of some kind, and then top-level civil servants and leaders of security forces and armed forces to decide. And then, of course, these intelligence, or in essence, spying services of various countries, armed and security and police forces, and now internet monitors increasingly, which information is relevant or not. The lesson here is that strategic priorities must be translated into specific guidelines that help operators understand which developments count or are important as threats. If strategic policymakers such as cabinet ministers or secretaries and members of parliament or Congress should not do that, they cannot expect operators to do that. The third lesson pertains to meaning making in crisis. We expect that political crisis managers seek to explain the causes of crisis, the reasons for them, that is, in a way that both convinces and exonerates. And this, of course, is quite a challenge. The Fortuyn case teaches us that explanations of past failures better be aligned with current actions. In other words, the response should be in sync with the storyline. The fourth and perhaps most important lesson pertains to the effects of flawed meaning making. As their narrative did not survive contact with reality, who then exploited the meaning-making failure with gusto or enthusiasm. The political heirs of Fortuyn were thus allowed to define the meaning of this crisis. Could this have been done differently? Political incumbents could have filled the campaign vacuum with the discourse of trusted ambassadors of the state. An inspiring example is found in Mr. Ivo Opstelten, who was then the mayor of Rotterdam, and although he was, I think, from the People's Party for Freedom and Democracy, he managed to channel emotions of grief and anger in his city by taking a neutral position towards the Pim Fortuyn list and reaching out to his citizens in an almost fatherly way. The lesson here is that a failed meaning-making can have serious consequences for the legitimacy of the ruling political class, and I would add, can also easily give a lot of fuel to various, even totally bizarre conspiracy theories which spread like wildfire on social media and partly on the mass media, because it's so difficult to monitor the internet, especially in the free and democratic societies such as the Netherlands. Governance capacity in times of crisis does not serve just functional aims such as restoration of order and protection of besieged or surrounded buildings. When it is perceived to fail, a crisis can quickly sap, in other words, radically reduce the trust in public institutions. The Fortuyn murder is one of the prime examples of how a seemingly isolated tragedy undermines societal trust in a set of critical institutions within a matter of days. I think it's appropriate to end this video now. And as always, you can analyze this video, and you can then, after critically having analyzed and examined it, you can take out of it what you believe is beneficial and relevant and edifying. Take care, and God bless and protect